Hello, everybody. In Module 3, I discussed models of agency problems. Module 3 has 6 lessons. Today, we focus on Lesson 5, adverse selection models. What does adverse selection mean? It refers to a friction in the economy when some people have private, unobservable information. How to deal with this? 2 types of solutions, disclosure solution and contracting solution. Module 4 would focus on disclosure solution. So today, in this lesson, we focus on contracting solution. This type of contracts is also called screening contracts, as those contracts screen out the agent's private information. Now let's look at the setup. The principal is a seller, and the agent is a buyer of a good. The seller does not know the buyer's valuation of the good. The buyer's valuation is buyer's private information. So the seller is going to offer the following contract. The seller is going to sell Q units to the buyer, and the buyer is going to pay the seller T. Buyer's utility function has 2 parts. Theta VQ represents the buyer's utility from consuming Q units of goods. Theta is the marginal valuation of the good, that is the buyer's private information, and the seller only knows the distribution of theta. Minus T, it represents the transfer from the buyer to the seller. The seller's utility function also has 2 parts. The payment from the buyer T minus the production cost CQ. We look at the simplest case when theta is binary. Theta can either be theta H or theta L. The prior distribution that theta is theta L is some probability beta from the seller's perspective. Let's first look at the first best case when the seller knows about the buyer's type. In this case, there is no IC constraint. IC constraint only applies when there are frictions in the economy. In this case, there is no friction. The only constraint is IR, which means you cannot set your TI to be too high, as otherwise the buyer is not going to be engaged in the transaction. So the seller chooses TI and QI for each type I that maximizes the seller's payoff from transacting with each type. The seller can do that because the seller can observe each buyer's type. Subject to the IR constraint, which means the expected utility from the buyer has to be bigger or equal than some reservation utility, which is normalized to 0. Similar to the discussion in the moral hazard settings, we can show that IR binds because the seller is not going to leave any money on the table. So TI would equal to theta I VQI for each type. And we can insert that into the objective function, take the first order condition, and that gets you the solution for the first best. We can also calculate the seller's total expected profit, which is beta times the seller's profit from transacting with type L plus 1 minus beta of seller's profit from transacting with type H. The buyer for each type gets the reservation payoff, and the seller gets all of the surplus. Now let's look at the case when the buyer's type is private, which means the seller does not know about the buyer's type. In this case, the seller is going to offer contracts of different types, and the buyer can choose from those contracts. Now the question is, how do we know how different types of buyers are going to choose what type of contract? Well, the answer is we just want to make sure when we design a contract, the contract has to be incentive compatible. Incentive compatible means that high type has no incentive to choose the contract offered and will be chosen by the low type and vice versa. So the seller is going to choose TI and QI for each type that maximizes the seller's expected payoff. Note here, the seller cannot maximize the payoff from transacting with each type of buyer because the seller does not observe the buyer's type. Subject to the usual IR constraint, now we have 2 more additional constraints, the IC constraint. The IC constraint says it has to be incentive compatible for type H to choose the contract offered to type H, and the same for type L. Now let's look at the constraint ICH. The left-hand side is the expected payoff for type H from choosing the contract offered to type H, which means buying QH units and paying the seller TH. The right-hand side is the expected payoff. Type H deviates to choosing the contract offered to type L, which means type H has to buy QL and pay the seller TL. However, the buyer is of H type. So the buyer's marginal valuation of the good is still C to H. So one can also view the contract design as if the buyer communicates the buyer's type C to whether it's H or L, and seller offers the contract. Without loss of generality, we can focus on contracts that induce truthful communication via the revelation principle, which is first discovered by Meyerson in his 1979 econometric paper. One thing I want to emphasize is the revelation principle does not say that people are not going to lie. Meyerson makes it very clear when he was interviewed for the Nobel Prize he got because of the revelation principle. The revelation principle simply says that it is without loss of generality to focus on contracts that induce truthful communication as a solution technique. And it is without loss of generality from the resource allocation perspective, because focusing on those type of contracts is going to generate the same payoff to the principal and agents than focusing on some other type of contracts. And it's not equivalent to the principle knowing the truth, because as we see in the previous slide, there are additional IC constraints that makes sure it is incentive compatible for the agent to communicate the truth. Let me give you a plain language explanation of the revelation principle. Suppose you're an organizer of a fish competition, and the person who catches the biggest fish gets $10,000. So here is the problem. You have 10 participants, but you only have 9 referees to verify the weight of fish caught. And the fish, whenever it's caught, has to be put back to the ocean. And let's say John is the player that's no referee is present to verify John's results. So now we have 2 ways to deal with this. The first is I would just say I give $10,000 prize to the person who claims to catch the biggest fish. In this case, John is always going to lie. John is going to come up with some very large numbers that the other 9 participants is not able to catch with the referee's monitoring. So in this case, John is going to get a $10,000 prize, even though John may not catch the biggest fish, because John is always going to lie. The second scenario is, let's just give $10,000 prize to John. And then I ask John to tell me truthfully the weight of fish that John catches. In this case, John has the incentive to tell me truthfully because he already guessed the price. So it makes no difference for him to tell truthfully or lie. Those 2 solutions are resource allocational equivalent because in both cases, John gets the $10,000 price. But in the second case, John would truthfully review the information that John has. So this is what the revelation principle says about. And this is what Meyerson 1979 says. Without loss of generality, you can focus on solving the allocation using the second method. Focus on truthful revelation contracts. So I'm going to provide a sketch of how to solve the model. We can show that both the ICH and IRL binds, so the incentive compatibility constraints for the high type and individual rationality constraint for the low type binds. So here's the intuition. Incentive compatibility means that you're concerned about people lying. What are you concerned about? You're more concerned about high type lying to be low type, because when you're designing contracts, as you're going to see, if somebody claims to be high type, you're going to sell that person more and charge that person more. So you're concerned about the high type lying to be low type, so they would charge less. But you're not concerned otherwise. You're not concerned about low type lying to be high type, because in this case, low type has to buy more goods and pay more, and they do not value that much about the goods as high type. In terms of individual rationality constraints, you're concerned about low type agents may not want to enter the contract because their valuation of the goods is lower. So they're less willing to trade in the first place. But you're less concerned about high type ones not wanting to enter the contract. So you're more concerned about low type participating, you're more concerned about high type lying. So that's why the incentive compatibility constraint for high type and individual rationality constraint for low type buying. And in adverse selection settings in general, the IC constraints of the highest type and IR constraints of the lowest type is going to bind. And we're going to see that informed party other than the lowest type is going to have a higher payoff than the reservation utility. And we call that they earn information rents. So the two binding constraints can result in some expression for TL and TH. And you insert that into the objective function. And now you get rid of the TL and TH. And the objective function would be a function of QL, QH, and exogenous variables. And you can see here, relative to the objective function for the first best case, the objective function for the second best case, under the 1 minus beta, dealing with high type, have this additional term, minus C to H minus C to L VQL. So this would be a decrease of the payoff of the principal. And this is the information rent earned by the high type to prevent the high type from mimicking the low type, because this is what you're most concerned about. And then first order condition with respect to QH and QL, you would get this solution. You're going to see C to H V prime QH is still C, but C to L V prime QL is going to be bigger than C. In the first pass, we have C to H V prime QH and C to L V prime QL is equal to C. So that means the quantities offered to the high type under the second best contract is the same as under the first best contract. But the quantities offered to the low type under the second best contract is smaller than it offered under the first best contract. And here's the intuition. The seller is going to reduce the amounts offered to the low type to avoid mimicking of high type. Because the high type enjoys more from consuming, so they want to consume more goods. That's why you're going to say for low type, you consume less. So the high type is not willing to mimic, to be the low type. And we can also see distortion is going to decrease in beta and increase in C to H minus C to L. And here is the intuition. If you have higher C to H minus C to L or lower beta, that means more adverse selection problems, because you're more concerned about high type lying to be low type or mimicking low type. When you have lower beta, you have more high type and lower low types. And if you have higher C to H minus C to L, the information advantage from the high types is higher because the types know about their C to, and you don't. The adverse selection is more severe and there will be more distortion on the first best. To conclude, adverse selection means that there is a friction when some party possesses private unobservable information. Such private information is usually called the agent's type. The revelation principle means that we can focus on contracting solutions that make an incentive compatible for the agents to review their private information truthfully. And the general solution or general result is that the lowest type's utility is the same as the first best, as the reservation utility. All higher types, they have higher utilities, means that earn information rent to prevent them from mimicking low types. And if you want to test your understanding of this lesson, a review quiz can be found on a link in the slides. Thank you very much.